Folks, just a heads up, we are recording this session. Let me go ahead and start them. In service to the Bray School Lab's mission to uncovering, documenting, preserving, and disseminating the history and legacies of the Williamsburg Bray School, 1760 to 1774. We host a monthly series on Zoom in order to share recent genealogical findings, engage the descendant community in this work in order to broaden our understanding of those legacies, and enlist the help of historians, genealogists, as well as the general public in furthering the conversations and the research surrounding the Williamsburg Bray School. The title of the monthly series is Bray School Stories, and this evening's focus is Seeking Mary and Elisha, or Elisha. We've heard both. And this is going to be a little different than the last few sessions. We're leaning more into that enlisting the help of historians and genealogists in the research. So first, some housekeeping items. Once again, we are recording this session. It will be available later on our YouTube channel. And to find it, simply Google Bray School Lab YouTube. If you prefer not to be recorded, please feel free to access this later, or just keep your camera off, but access this later from our YouTube channel. So the monthly sessions are designed to spark conversation. I'll share a slide and then some information, and then we'll pause to take questions and invite you to share your thoughts and your comments. So a few things that came up out of last month's session is really kind of accessing the research that we're doing in the William and Mary Bray School Lab, and just kind of figuring out how to maneuver through our website. So I thought I would kind of walk us through that a little bit before we get started on Mary and Elisha. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And where am I? There we go. Excellent. So this is our starting point this evening. And we're going to go ahead and look at the William and Mary Bray School Lab website. And really what I want you to be able to come away with is where to find the compiled lists, those attendance lists for the students from 1762, 1765, and 1769. And we're also to find some of the projects and the research. So let me go ahead and switch over now to the Bray School Lab website. Can everyone see that on their screen?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So when you get to the Bray School Lab website, that iconic picture of the Bray School from the 1920s is right there, front and center. And as you scroll down, you have some things here on the left-hand side of the screen, as well as some things on the right. The right shows our upcoming events, so here we are this evening, and also some other things happening soon in the next few weeks. But what I want to draw your attention to first is how to find those lists. We can find the lists either singly transcribed, and I'll show that to you in our research portal, or we can go to the compiled lists. And to get there, we're going to go over to this left-hand side of your screen. We're going to click on
Elizabeth, this is
Yes.
Maureen. I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt in flow. We
That's
saw
okay.
the original PowerPoint slide with the link, but we are not in sync with you in that we're not seeing you move through the actual website.
Okay, so what you're seeing right here is not the website.
Just the slide with the link on it.
Oh, okay.
So you may have to if you could another tab, open it and then just change what you're sharing, that might
Okay,
work.
great.
We'll give you a cue when it's working.
Okay, shoot, let's see. All right, new share, and here we go. How's that?
Yes, we are seeing it right now. If you click something, I'll let you know that it's working fully.
Okay, so we've just clicked on research and engagement.
Yes, it's working. Thanks.
Okay, good. Thank you. So under research engagement, if you wanted to go just to the compiled lists, you would drop down to Bray School Descendants. And so you would click on Bray School Descendants. And here in the last paragraph, the Bray School Lab has created a one-page fact sheet, as well as the compilation of all extant student lists affiliated with this school. So you'd have to do is just click on that, and up pops the lists. We've compiled the list with the names of the student and the year that they attended. And again, we only have 3 lists at this point. We are hoping that more attendance lists or school reports with names of the students will be found in the course of the research. But for right now, we have lists for 1762, 1765, and 1769 only at this point. We've listed the students as well as their year that they attended, if they were enslaved, their enslaver's household's name, and also the occupation of their enslaver. And down at the bottom on the second page are the students who came from free Black households. So here we have Mary in 1762 and Elisha in 1762. And those are the 2 students we're going to be focusing on this evening. But before we get there, let me go back and look a little bit more at some of the research portal. So I've just gone back to just one page back out. And again, on the left-hand side, you have some options here. So if you want to see the transcription of the correspondence of the Bray Associates and also the individual transcribed student attendance lists, you would go to the research portal. It takes a little while to open up because we have a lot of documentation in there. So there we go. Is everyone seeing that now?
Yes.
Perfect. So we have some images that when the school building itself was still in William and Mary's possession, Grace Helmick, our fantastic media technician, took many, many photographs as the building was being before it got moved. We also have our records project, and this is where you would find all the correspondence that we have transcribed, that our William and Mary students have transcribed. And then you'll also start to see our oral histories that Tanya Meredith has been recording are starting to be populated into that research portal. So this is how we get to that research portal and all the research. And it's free to access, and you're welcome to visit and kind of go throughout the website at your leisure. So let me go ahead and go back to this. All right. Next thing we want to be able to show is the mapping project that we have, where we've imagined 2 of the students, Adam and Fanny, and kind of what their world would have been like. To get there, you go to the website again, and I will share that screen. And when you get to the website, there we go. You will have gone from, let's see if I can get there. If you go through our media site, so if you're on the main page, you go down on the right-hand side, our media, Adam and Fanny's World. You can click on there. We have a summary of it, but to get to there, go to the second paragraph under the full description and click on the link Adam and Fanny. And this allows you what our students have done is really taken the primary documentation, photographs of historic buildings, and we've mapped, as well as current day activities and endeavors on William and Mary's campus. We've kind of created an entire story map of what Adam and Fanny might have experienced in a day in the life, in their life. So we just want to be able to highlight the work of our students, as well as give you a sense of some other assets that we have available that's taking the research maybe in a bit more of a historical imaginings way. And then the last thing I wanted to make sure that you all are able to access, oh, before I forget, We're going to be having a new asset coming on soon. Nicole Brown, our grad student, as well as one of our student thought partners, have put together a mapping regarding the needle points, a needlepoint story map, where you'll be able to see kind of the way the stitching was done on samplers, some historic documentation associated with that. So that's coming soon, hopefully by the end of this month. And then the other thing we wanted to highlight, of course, is the YouTube channel, where you will find the Bray School Story series, as well as some other projects that is coming out of the division. The William and Mary Bray School Lab is under the division of the Office of Strategic Cultural Partnerships. So there's some other recordings there as well. So let me show you, this is the website, but let me show you where to find that. Where did I put that? There we go. So when you get to the YouTube page, you'll find the recordings of the past Bray School Stories Zoom series, the compilation video of our oral history that Tanya put together, as well as some other things coming out of SCP, some conference participation, as well as some other William and Mary engagement. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of how to maneuver through the website and what opportunities were there for you to kind of explore. And we are going to be doing some updates to our website in the next few months. So it might look a little different, but the information will still be there, and hopefully a lot more stuff is going to be added as well. So we're kind of excited about that. But let's get back to why we were all here this evening. So let me go ahead and share this, and we will start from here. All right. Are we all together now with Seeking Mary and Elisha? So where we begin with that 1762 attendance list, where Mary Jones and Elisha or Elisha Jones is listed. They're both marked as free, but in an entire attendance list where all the other ages for the children attending that particular year, we have no age listed for either of the Jones children, nor do we have the names of their parents. All we know is a surname, Mary Jones and Elisha Jones. And there is a lot of talk about whether or not Elisha is a boy or a girl. Is it Elisha, as in a biblical name, or Elisha, as it's been portrayed in colonial Williamsburg in the past? So we didn't have very much to go on, but this is where we started. So any questions about the attendance list, about what we know about Mary, any observations from what you're seeing here on the screen? No? All right. Well, we'll go ahead. We'll keep going forward and see where we go next. So the other thing we had available to us was a book by Colonel Lafayette Jones Jr. Now, unfortunately, we just lost Colonel Jones last month. He passed away on February 16th. So we didn't have an opportunity to really talk with him about all the things that he had heard from his family and the research that he had done. But what we are left with is this wonderful book. And you can see my, my tabs that I had put into my copy that we have at the office. And in that book, he left us some clues. Let's see if I can get this to go. There we go. Some members of the Jones family attended this school, and he's referring to the Bray School, and later became residents of the hot water settlement. He talked about how his grandfather said that the Bray School students were able to read and write, and they were referred in the community as the first Black teachers in Virginia. And then he also talks about in the 1800s, the education of free Blacks and slaves was prohibited, but the young students who had attended the Bray School continued to teach other students, other Black children in secret. And these were the tenets of the Williamsburg Bray School, was that it was supposed to be that the lessons that were being taught at the school were to be passed along to other people, either in an enslaved household or within a family and within a community. So what we have to go on is the attendance list that Mary and Elisha attended the school, and that there is memory from the community that still exists up to this day about the impact that the school had in that community. But this wasn't a lot for us to go on for finding Mary and Elisha. So where did we go next? Well, we always go to, if we can visit a site, we do. And so I took a trip over to Freedom Park, which is in James City County, just outside Williamsburg. And Freedom Park is where the hot water track really is kind of found. And the hot water track was an area of land that was set aside that was near William Ludwell Lee's farm. And William Ludwell Lee died in 1803, and in his will, he made provisions to free a lot of his enslaved people. And so this park was recreated, and at the cabins that were recreated were for the Brown family, the Lightfoot family, and the Jackson family. We were hoping there'd be some Joneses. But inside the cabin, we do see a slate. We see clay marbles, which we know that were found, pieces of slate pencil, pieces of clay marbles were found at the Bray School site. And so was that education still being carried on? It's kind of a clue that that education was still being carried on. But William Ludwell Lee and the formation of the hot water track is 1803. So that's a significant amount of time after Mary and Elisha would have attended the Bray School. So we went back, so looking a little bit more deeply into his book for any other clues that we could find. We find that prior to the establishment of that as a place, we know that there was already a Black community living and working there. So that kind of helps us to think about whether or not that's where the Jones family already was living when they were sending Mary and Elisha to school. A lot of the enslaved children, most of the enslaved children who are attending the Williamsburg Bray School are coming from right downtown in Williamsburg. I mean, they're coming right off of, Dog Street, as well as the surrounding streets. But we haven't been able to establish where the Jones children and the Ashby children would have been walking to school from and walking back after the school day ended. And so we're trying to pull together just to get ourselves geographically locating where would these communities have been. So Colonel Jones's book does give us an indication that there were people living at that area prior to 1803. We know that some of them ventured into the world of entrepreneurship, selling parts of their crops at local markets, and others were able to purchase property as well as servants. And he was very clear to say that normally the slaves or the servants purchased by the free Blacks were their own spouses and their children and other relatives. And so we certainly see that with the Ashby family, where Matthew Ashby purchases his child, John and Mary, as well as his wife, Anne. So when we start to look in the records, if we don't have an indication of whether or not they are a free Black family or a free white family, we don't necessarily want to rule out an entry that seems to list enslaved people in a household and just automatically say, well, that can't be a Black family, because it may actually have been a free Black family, and the record taker may be including the spouse and the children who technically would still be enslaved if the head of the household had not been allowed yet to grant freedom. So again, just some clues coming out of the book. So then the next step for any type of free African-American genealogical research is to go to Paul Heinig's work. Paul Heinig has done an amazing amount of work of going through microfilm and court records and deeds and compiling information all over Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina. And his website is free and he updates it. And it's not just a long list of people from the court records or from deeds. He also has very other specific lists dating back to the Revolutionary War time, tax lists, other types of records that he's uncovered. And I highly recommend this for free African American research, just to go and visit his site. So of course I went and visited it. And before I move on, I realize I have just been talking and I haven't stopped to ask if anyone has any questions or comments on the last few slides. I apologize for that. Anything that has kind of maybe rung true with your own research, or suggestions that you might have that might have been overlooked at this point? All right, I'm going to take that as we're free to go ahead and move along. So what I found on Paul Heinig's website was for York County, didn't find much for James City County, didn't find anything for Williamsburg, but York County yielded some hits on Joneses. But really what he had were Mary, born, say, 1755, attended the school in Williamsburg, and Elisha, born in 1757. Now, where those dates of birth are coming from, I'm not really sure. It could just be kind of a supposition that to have attended the school, we know the ages would be between 3 and 10, and they attended in 1762. So maybe it was a guess on his part. But what I see was they didn't have much more information on these two students than we had already started with. And yet we do have a long list of other Jones family members, but what we don't know is how they all connect, whether there are parents and grandparents in this list, whether there are brothers and sisters. And we know York County is in there, and we know some James City County tax records and references are in there. So it was good exercise to check to see if Heinig's work had anything, and I certainly keep this and refer back to it. But it didn't yield any additional information on the two students as I had hoped. So any suggestions, anything that's catching your eye on this document, anything that perhaps needs to be taken a further look-see that anyone sees? Happy to have some suggestions. We do know that if we're talking about two girls, or we even know for Mary Jones, that we may be looking and not just sticking with a Jones search, that we may actually need to consider the fact that she could have gotten married, and we would be looking for Mary with another surname, which makes this a little bit more challenging as well, unless we know from a Jones family descendant what other family they would have married into. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. But please, if you have any questions or something's not clear, please feel free to ask while we're going along. So we needed to go back to records from the time that Mary and Elisha would have attended school. So we go to the Bruton Parish Register, where we've been successful finding some of the enslaved children that went and attended the school. And we do know that there were free people of color whose baptism records are recorded. And so in 1748, we see that Eleanor, the daughter of Bash Jones, a free Negro, using the terminology at the time, was baptized at Bruton Parish Register. 1748 would have been a little bit before Mary or Elisha would have been born if they were attending the Bray School. That would have put them, if they were born in 48 or 49, that late 1740s, that would have put them a little old to attend the school, but Eleanor could have been an older sister perhaps. And maybe Bash Jones had additional children, but this is the only entry we have in Bruton Parish Register for him. Later in 1767, we see that James Jones and Margaret, his wife, were free. They're described as free mulatto. Their son John was born in March of 1767. We don't know whether James could have been a sibling of Mary or Elisha, and if John would have been a sibling, and James and Margaret could have been their parents. Just don't have enough information to go on. But you have to check everything. You have to looking everywhere for clues as best we could. So that was the Bruton Parish Registers. And before I go on to the next slide, any questions about this? Any comments? Any concerns? Anything I can answer? Any questions I can answer? So then the next record that I checked are the tax records. And the earliest tax records we had for Williamsburg is 1783. And so in the beginning of 1783 in Virginia, in the tax records, you're going to have a listing of people who are going to be charged a tax. And it's usually the head of the household is responsible. Fortunately for Williamsburg, everything was listed in alphabetical order. Unfortunately, we had no Joneses listed in Williamsburg tax records for 1783. We go from William Hull to Francis Jaron, and that was at the bottom of the first page. And then the top of the second page, we go to James Innes and then William Lewis. And so we kind of struck out that there weren't any Jones families enumerated in the tax records for 1783. But we also have to keep that geography in mind. We've got York County, we've got James City County. So we're going to check those tax records as well. And in James City County, earlier than in 1783 and 1782, we were able to get some hits. There were two different parishes that had tax lists with Jones families in them. So Blissland Parish and Lower Precinct. And each of the tax list takers, ordered their columns differently. So it's always important to check out the columns. So here we have where the list of slaves would be, and this is the column where freemen would be. And what we find is a James Jones with no enslaved people and one freeman. And we have Sarah Jones, no enslaved. And of course, she's not going to be listed as a free man. She's a free woman. But then we also have John Jones and Elsie Jones. Now, again, these folks are listed with enslaved people in their household, 4 for Elsie Jones and 1 for John Jones. So we don't know whether these folks are people of color with members of their family just listed in the slave column, or whether or not these are actually white folks as well. But it gives us a clue. So what I started to do was to go through year by year, county by county, pulling out any possible Jones names to see if we could find any pattern, any repeat of Mary or Elisha, that name. And so that was my goal with doing that. Over on the lower precinct list, we had the number of slaves is listed now in the second column, and that produced an Abraham Jones, as well as a James Jones and a Lucy Jones, all without any enslaved people in their household. Again, we don't know whether these folks are free people of color or free white people in the list. So any questions before we go on to the York County findings? No? Okay. All right, we'll move on. So we've covered Williamsburg. For 1783, there wasn't a 1782 list. We tried to go as early as we could when James City County, that was in 1782. Likewise, York County, 1782, the upper district. And so we were able to find Erasmus Jones and Dudley Jones. And both had either, they had either none or one enslaved person in their list. And York County did things a little differently in their columns as well. And then we didn't see any Joneses in York County until 1785. And that's when we see a Margaret Jones with no enslaved people in their household. Again, this doesn't really get us any closer to finding Mary and Elisha or making any connections to them. But it is part of the work of going through and trying to pull all the pieces that we can to see if somehow there's going to be a pattern, or we're going to find some sort of connection or some sort of clue. It is tedious, but it's really important to go through those records and to really kind of do it diligently. I'm not going to show you all 30 pages of the transcribed tax records by year up to 1850, I think is where I went. But did not find Elisha or a repeat of that name, and did not find a Mary Jones. So the other thing that we did find, I just want to go ahead just to continue, that James City County in 1791, many more Jones names start to pop up at this point. We have Stephen Jones and Isham Jones. We have James Jones Jr., and it says Jockey's Neck. James Jones Sr., ditto. John Jones, near Williamsburg. John Jones. So all of a sudden, thankfully, the tax collector in James City County by 1791 started to give some indication of where they were living. He wasn't doing that for our benefit. He was doing that basically to distinguish between people of the same name. And we always have to remember that even though there's a junior and senior next to each other, it doesn't automatically assume that they're son and father. It may mean that just one is the older and one's younger. One could be an uncle. So we would want to track that through the tax records to see, if there's any indication of doing that, not only just with the tax records, but in conjunction with other records to see if we can figure out what the relationship is between people of that same name who are also given that junior and that senior suffix. So any questions, anything striking you, anything jumping out, anyone saying, wait a second, I have a family member on this list. All right. So after going through, yes.
There's a comment from Jeanette Gordon Weaver. I have a fourth great grandmother, Dorcas Jones, circa 1830.
Oh, we're going to see her in just a moment. Yes. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, she does come up. Anybody else? I'm going to write that down.
Her father, Elizabeth, his name was Daniel Jones, and he's about 1810, I think.
Okay, Daniel is Dorcas's father. Okay. Father to Dorcas. Excellent. Oh my goodness, wonderful. So I would be looking for Daniel Jones. Yes, yes, they're so okay,
Yes.
good. Excellent. Thank you. All right. Anyone else? Any other comments, curiosities, anything about this record?
On Friday night, Mary Lassiter was talking about an Isham Jones.
Okay. And we do know that Mary's got Jones in her family too. So let me connect Isham Jones with Mary. Okay. Terrific. Excellent. Excellent. Okay, good. Thank you. All right. Well, so after looking through Paul Heinig's book, after looking and starting to delve into the tax records, we certainly also want to consider the free registers, also known as the free Negro registers, using that terminology from that time. But in 1793, the Virginia General Assembly passed that people who were free people of color basically had to show, they had to register at the county courthouse, and they had to show how they came by their freedom, whether they were born free, whether they were emancipated, and show and prove their manumission. This is definitely a scenario. It's not a scenario. This is where, as genealogists, we start to use records that were not necessarily created for genealogical research, but we use them because they can be a wealth of information. And so while these registers and this procedure of having to go to the courthouse every year, every 3 years, because the law changed and the counties weren't always consistent, but to prove your free status was certainly a surveillance tactic that was not imposed on any other community of people. And so while the registrations themselves and the whole act of that, having to register, is something we certainly don't want to celebrate, as genealogists and family historians, they do provide an enormous amount of information. And so we are actually fortunate to have those records. Some of the counties will have them in separate books, and it will be a book that is the free register. Other times, these lists are found in the oddest places, and they're just stuck at the end of certain rolls and other ledgers. And so if you're searching in a particular county and they don't have something that's specific free register, you might need to do a little bit of digging in some of the other records. So for instance, for York County, they started to be found in the guardian account books. So that's a court record where if you are an orphan and you have an estate and your guardian is assigned to you and has to maintain your estate until you come of age, these are the account books. But intermixed in these account books are also the registrations for free people living in York County. And so this is an example of one for a James Jones. And so what type of information can we find in there? We find his name, we find his age. He's registered in February of 1816, so we can get his circa date of birth from that. And we also learned that he was born of free parents. And it gives us it tells a little bit about his complexion, his height, and we get a description of him. And again, this was for surveillance purposes, but if this is your ancestor, you are given this gift of having a little bit of a sense of what your ancestor might look like. So I use this as an example because we did go through all the Joneses that we could from all the registers. And what we were able to find is that in York County, in the York County Records Project, these have all been typed up and they're available at the Rockefeller Library. Not only they've been typed up, but they're also been alphabetized. You can get a list either alphabetized or you can get a list in chronological order. And these are the ones, this is the page from the Jones registers from the York County Records Project. So in 1809, we have a Dicey Jones who was born circa 1749. 1810, we have Ishmael Jones. We have James Jones, who registered in 1818 and 1822. We believe that might be the same person based on the description. Slightly different description about his facial features from one year to the next, but we believe that's the same one, the same person. Then we have Jenny Jones, we have Polly Jones in 1805. Again, no Mary and no Elisha. But, you know, we're not going to let any stone go unturned at this point. So this is York County. And so totally recommend if you're local and you can get to the Rockefeller Library, or if you're going to be traveling to Williamsburg and have a chance to go to the Rockefeller Library and you want to see these records, these are they're available and they're nicely typed up. Otherwise, the records themselves are available online for free through FamilySearch.org. But again, you'd want to be looking for the Guardian account book. You're not going to be kind of Googling the free, or searching rather, the free registers. So that's York County. In James City County in 1834, at least, after all the tax lists had been done, there was a blank page and then there was a list. And this was the list of free Negroes and mulattoes, again, the terminology at that time, in the county of James City. And what we were able to find is there was, so I just kind of zoomed in on just one page. We have James Jones Sr., Isabel, his wife, children James and Harriet and Thomas, Betsy, Jane, and Matilda. So 8 people in the family. He was a shoemaker and she was a washer, and they lived on their own land. So if you are only looking in the census records, you're only going to get James Jones's name. And then there are going to be tick marks under the age brackets for the people in this household. But this is a gift because in between that 1830 and 1840 census, and even before 1850, when we finally get the names of the other people living in the house, you get the name of his wife, the relationship of him to his wife, as well as their children's names, not just the number of children he had, but the children's names. So these records, while they're not showing us any Mary or Elisha, they are really a gold mine for family historians to make sure that you're looking for these records. Likewise, Sally Jones here and children, Dudley, William, Richard, and Susan. And she's a farmer and lives on her own land. And this is 1834 in James City County. And where else? And then in 1833, and this is separately in York County, this is also at the Library of Virginia. And so for 1833, 1834, and 35, I can't remember if it's 36 as well, but I know it's 35. If you go to Virginia Untold, it's all online, accessible, and free. You get these beautiful lists of Jones families, as well as all the other people living in 1834 and 1833 living in York County. And so these are separate from the registers. These were just lists that were taken, separate from the tax lists, separate from the registers. So again, we're looking for any clue that could lead us to linking descendants who are alive today to those Bray School Jones scholars. And so here we have Dorcas Jones. And we have her children, George and Sally, and a child that's not named, and then Scott, Tom Scott, a boy who's living in that household. We also have another James Jones, his wife Charlotte Mead, and her children. So that's an interesting thing. Do we know that, so we know he's married, so James Jones is married to Charlotte, but she brought children to that marriage. We have James Jones and wife Mary, and then a David Banks, who's a resident of the family. I've talked with the people at the Library of Virginia about what that term means, resident of the family. Does it necessarily include, does it mean, or can it infer biological relationship? Could it be an uncle, a nephew, brother-in-law, something like that? They think it probably is a family member. But again, we can't make any assumption that it's a direct line. It could be a collateral line, or it could just be somebody who has been taken in by the family. So any questions on these variety of records that we've been searching for and looking at in order to find Mary and Elisha?
Well, Dorcas's unnamed child was Victoria.
Oh,
That is my great-great-mother. And she was married to she married at some point a man named Pryor Jackson. So all of those Jacksons that were on that list that you had, yeah, they would have been near each other anyway.
Okay. So Victoria is the unnamed child.
Yep.
Victoria. Wonderful. All right. So I'm writing all this down before I forget it. Okay. So Dorcas, who was the daughter of Daniel,
Yep.
had a daughter, Victoria, who married a Jackson. What was Jackson? What was the first name for Mr. Jackson?
Pryor, Pryor.
Excellent. 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 Wow. Awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty cool seeing her name down there.
Yeah. Had you seen this record before, John? Have I
I
shared
had
this with
not
you?
seen that record. There are others that I have, but this is something new to me.
All right. Do you want me to send that to you tomorrow or this afternoon, this evening?
You sure can.
Okay. So York County, 1833 to Johnette. Excellent. Oh my goodness. Okay. So now I'm looking at the time. So we're going to go through a little bit more, just other areas we've been trying to find some clues. This is another book that we came across called Twin Paths to Freedom. And what we were able to find from these pages is a James Jones and his wife living at Hot Water Track. Miss McCarthy goes on to, McCartney rather, says that Corin must have died because the next year James Jones and wife Anna with a newborn McManus are living on their own land. And she gives a little bit of an overview of two Jones families. One is the James Jones family and where they're living. And then another is the William Jones, who was freed by William Norval's will. And that's another person who is freeing people around the same time as William Ludwell Lee. And this actually shows up in the tax records. As the people are freed from these two enslavers, it actually is noted, their names are noted in the tax records, freed by either W. Lee, W.L. Lee, or W. Norval. And so because we know that Mary and Elisha, who went to the Bray School, were free, we know that they probably didn't come from the William Jones family unless William Jones's wife would have also been free, except actually this would have been too far along. This would have been too much later in the game for them to have been the parents for William or for Mary and Elisha. But again, we're still trying to pull as much information as we can on the Jones family. I want to make sure that we're leaving enough time for conversation and questions. I'm going to kind of go quickly through the next few slides because it is important for us to kind of just have a sense of the geography that we're talking about, where some of these places are located so that we can see in relation to where the Bray School was, where William and Mary was, where Williamsburg is, where are the communities in York County, in James City County, as well as in near Williamsburg and beyond. And this is an 1865 map from the Confederate soldier who wrote all this out. And we see right here, Free Negro Settlement right here, which we believe is that's where Freedom Park would have been, where Hot Water Track would have been. So I know I'm going kind of quickly through this, but I was also looking at some of these maps to see if we could see any Jones family homesteads, like a dot on the list. So far, not yet. But again, we're trying, I'm trying all angles that we can to find these, the families of these two students. This has just happened in the last few weeks, and I wanted to bring it to your attention. This is more genealogy related and searching, but I really want to make sure you guys are aware of this. And this is Family Search finally is utilizing a little bit of artificial intelligence to do full text searching. Now, it's still in very experimental stage. And it is only two collections that they have available right now. One is the U.S. Land and Probate Records, which is awesome because that's a really good one to start with. And I want to bring bring your attention to a blog written by Judy Russell, who goes by the Legal Genealogist. And I'm going to put this I'm going to put her address in the chat because I really want you guys to be able to see this if you can. Take a look at this and it'll tell you about these searches. And I've started to use it. I'm not going to say I was totally successful, but it is, I think it's going to be interesting and I think it's going to be helpful in research. So I'm going to put that in the chat right now. And then I'm also going to put the family search link in the chat as well, so that you have it. Let's see, I turn off the chat and there we go. And then let's see. I'm going to go from current screen. So what I want to show you is when you go to family search and you go to the full text search, you're going to have a screen that looks like this. Again, lots of warnings that this is experimental. It's not guaranteed. It's not even guaranteed to always be available. But if you have a chance, I totally recommend playing around with it a little bit. You can put the name of the ancestor that you're looking for, as well as any keywords that you want to, what happened? So the keywords that you're going to be using in your search. And so I put in James City County plus Virginia in my keyword search. And then in the name, I put Elisha Jones. Now, it came up with some Elisha Joneses in the 1800s, which was kind of exciting. It also came up with 3,216 and 162 results. So I don't have time to go through all of those. And also they're going to be counting anytime Virginia and Elisha is repeated in it. But I just want you to be able to have access to this information, that this is in an experimental stage, but it might really be very helpful in your searching. And so so if there's an Elisha Jones in Carroll County in 1849, I probably want to take a look at it. But that's going to be also tracking some migration, which means this is going to be broadening this outside of James City County, outside of York County, way outside Williamsburg. So before we take a huge leap, or before I take a huge leap from going from the 1760s attendance list for these kids to all of a sudden a completely different county way outside what would have been kind of that normal bounds, I want to make sure that I'm, really looking at this carefully. But the fact that that name is popping up where it wasn't popping up at all in any of the tax records, a repeating of that name, is it any kind of clue that perhaps I should be looking broader? So that leads us to our research questions and next steps. How to connect the Jones family members from hot water track to the Bray School scholars. I haven't gone through the court records and the deeds just yet. That's the next thing I need to tackle. And Paul Heinig has done quite a bit of that. So for me to come back through and see if there's anything else that, with very much a focus on the Bray School scholars, that's what I would be doing. And certainly we're engaging the local Jones family members. Thank you, Johnette, for being here. And Mary Lassiter and I are actually getting together next week to talk more on some other lines, but I definitely want to bring in the Jones lines again with her. I want to highlight that we are having an event for the local descendants and local Bray School folks here in Williamsburg next Monday evening. This is a registration required event. I believe we may have actually hit capacity this afternoon because it is very much a hands-on nature, and there's going to be instruction on needlepoint. And of course, that is something that the kids were taught, the girls specifically were taught at the Bray School. We did have to limit the numbers, but if you're interested in registering and being put on a wait list, I can drop the link in the chat. And then the last thing we wanted to kind of talk about was, or even just mention, is that we are going to be having an annual Descendants Week here in Williamsburg from April 15th to the 20th. And there'll be some activities. There'll be online town hall Zoom session on, I believe, Monday evening. There'll be some activities in Colonial Williamsburg, a walking tour perhaps. We're still working out some of the details. And then on Saturday, we're going to do a family history day with lots of activities for parents and children and grandparents to really join in and be a part of that. And as always, we want you to stay tuned for things that are coming up in having to do with the Bray School. Of course, we are affectionately calling 2024 the year of the Bray School. The restored Williamsburg Bray School will be opening in the fall in Colonial Williamsburg. So there's lots of excitement in the months leading up to that happening. But I just appreciate you all being here this evening. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and see if there's any questions, comments, suggestions from the group this evening. Whew.
Hi, Elizabeth. Maureen again. I'll get it started. Again, once again, a great session. The Elisha versus Elisha Jones question. Obviously, it's important to be able to determine that because that's going to change the trajectory of research. What's kind of the smoking gun you're looking for that you would need to find to definitively make that determination?
Oof, that's a good question. I think if there are some times where we see in free registers that a gender is listed, you know, he is described as, or he has. And we've looked at this when we're looking at the name London as well. And is the preponderance for more men to be named London or girls to be named London? So I think if we could find an entry for Elisha where there's descriptors, that would be super helpful. I would love it if there was a baptism record, perhaps from First Baptist Church. If we went through, I know that when I went through the microfilm rolls, just barely scratching the surface, but there's a microfilm roll at Rockefeller Library. This has meeting minutes from, I think it's the 1870s. I don't think it's the 1880s, but there was an Elisha Jones listed there. Now, obviously, that's not the same one as who went to the Bray School because it's 100 years later. But it seemed to me that that was tipping it toward, because he was described as a he. He was mentioned in the record. So that's what I would be looking for, if that makes sense.
Great.
Are there links that I can put in the chat? Anything that you were curious about? We didn't really do a bibliography this time since we really haven't found anything specifically on our two students that we're searching for. Anything I can walk you through? I'm now looking at the chat. Oh my goodness. It's been busy while I've been talking. Well, I certainly want to be respectful of your time. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your interest in this story and even interest in when we're not finding as much as we always hope to find. But stay with us, stay tuned. We're not giving up. We're going to keep at this and try to make those connections. We do know that there are Jones family members here in Williamsburg with deep roots, and we know that they go back to Elisha and to Mary. It's just a matter of finding all the links that we can find to that little breadcrumb trail. I keep describing the endeavor as a jigsaw puzzle, and right now we're just trying to put all the pieces out on the table. We haven't connected, especially for the Jones kids, we haven't connected the pieces just yet, but we'll get there. So. All right. Well, folks, again, unless there are any, I'm happy to stay on for a little bit longer, happy to answer any questions. Again, the recording will be up hopefully by the end of the week, if not next week. And please feel free to contact us at the lab. or email me. Just, just Google Bray School Lab and our contact information should pop up. And feel free to look around the website and certainly ask us questions if there are things that come to mind. We appreciate any feedback that we get.
I want to remind everyone that the general email is braylab@wm.edu. So braylab@wilmary.edu.
Let me see if I can put that. Okay, good. I just added that in the chat. Oh, perfect. Very good. All right. Well, thanks everyone. I'm going to go ahead and switch us off unless you want to stay on a little longer.